Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Managing Impacts of Pollution on Mangrove Ecosystems webinar with the Global Mangrove Alliance. I'm Dr. Chris Brown from the Global Wetlands Project, and I'm co-lead of the Mangrove Alliance's Science Working Group. I just wanted to start to say in Australia, it's traditional to pay respects to the Indigenous people whose land on which we work. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Palawa of Tasmania and extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples across the different lands that we're watching from today. So I'm really excited to have three speakers from across the world today to talk to this topic of pollution in mangrove ecosystems. We have Associate Professor Anusha Rajkaran from the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation Biology, University of Western Cape in South Africa. We have Dr. Anwesha Ghosh from the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Kolkata, and Dr. Prasun Goswami from the National Institute of Animal Health in Tsukuba, Japan. And so our three panelists today will each do a 5-minute presentation, and then that will leave plenty of time for question and answers afterwards. If your question comes up for you while they're speaking, feel free to use the Q&A button, which you'll see down the bottom of your Zoom screen, to type in that question. Or you can raise a hand and I can perhaps allow you to speak if there's time. So without further ado, we'll hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Anusha Rajkaran.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar, and thank you to Chris for organizing it. So I'm just going to share my screen. So you should be able to see my slideshow.
Let's come up.
Great.
You're good.
Perfect. So thanks. So I'm speaking to you from Cape Town in South Africa, where I am a investigator in a group that works on estuaries, and in specific, or in particular, we work on mangrove forests. And in the last few years, we've really focused our research on the impact of pollutants in these systems as this becomes more and more topical. So we have in the last 5 years had more and more articles like the ones that you can see on the screen, where we have an increased number of sewage spills taking place within our estuaries. And it's really forced us to ask, are our estuaries becoming extensions of the toilet systems in our country? We've also had these really massive flood events that have taken place in very specific parts of our coastline. And these have had, and we're trying to work out the effects these have had on both the estuarine environment and our mangrove forests. So in South Africa, our mangrove forests are within 2 provinces. This is in KwaZulu-Natal. So here's the map that shows this. And within Richards Bay and Durban, we find many of our urban systems. And these urban systems find themselves in harbors, as well as within industrial and urbanized areas. And this is very different to what we find in the Eastern Cape, where we have more peri-urban to rural systems, where the disturbances are very different compared to KwaZulu-Natal and are very much related to subsistence and utilization of resources. So within our research protocol, we have been looking at a number of pollutants, and I've put up microplastics as the first slide here. But in conjunction with microplastics, we've also looked at heavy metal pollutants and looked at a suite of biological responses such as microbial communities, the mangrove forests themselves in terms of their population structure, and also the animal communities. And we've always tried to look at differences within seasons for our different pollutants. So here we have our microplastics in wet seasons, dry seasons, and a combination. And what we were hoping to find was that our peri-urban to rural areas would have a lower density of microplastics within the water column and the sediment environment. And this is not really what we're picking up. We're finding a much more unilateral distribution of microplastics within these systems, even though some of them may not be connected to urban sites or big cities. We're also finding that our sediment environment is becoming a very important sink for microplastics. And of course, this would have an impact on the microbial environment. And also, we would expect there to be an impact on carbon sequestration and the delivery of ecosystem services. And of course, with ecosystem services, we know that mangroves are very important refugia sites. So we've also looked at microplastics within the fish individuals, and in particular juveniles. And more recently, we've looked at what's happening within the crab environment or within the crab species. And what we've found, especially very recently, that even our very highly diverse mangrove systems, where we have a wide variety of biota, they're still able to take hold and be present in our highly urbanized and very polluted systems. So these seem to show a resilience to these environments. And of course, we would then have to look into what is the population level effects of these pollutants, especially on the animals such as the fiddler crabs, which are the ecosystem engineers within the mangrove forests. We've also looked at heavy metals, and very recently we had a field trip to KwaZulu-Natal where we looked at the population structure of the mangroves, and it forced us to ask how resilient are the different life stages of mangroves to polluted environments. So here we have our urbanized sites, which is Durban Bay, Mgeni, and Isipingo, compared to our non-urbanized sites. And we find that some of these areas are highly polluted. And what we're finding is a lack of seedlings and saplings within these environments. So just to put it into some sort of framework, we know we've been measuring the state of our mangrove forests for a very long period of time. And more recently, we've included this layer of pollutants. So we know that the impacts can include lower species diversity, an impact on carbon sequestration, and changes in population structure. And we've tried to communicate this to the different government departments because since last year we've seen this limitation between seedlings to saplings in terms of our mangrove forests. And we're trying to understand whether this is limited due to light, or if this is limited to pollutants. So we recently had a 2-hour meeting with our government departments to express this to them. And during that meeting, we try to identify what are the interests of government within this particular ecosystem. And they were asking us for information on health, especially with the heavy metal pollutants and the dependency of communities on the different biota. They were very much interested in the seedling to sapling survival rates and the resilience to current environmental conditions, as well as restoration and rehabilitation, particularly in our harbor areas. And of course, they were very interested in the levels of biodiversity and changes within these biodiversity. And this is probably linked to the different conventions that South Africa has signed themselves up to. So just in conclusion, I'm sure everyone knows the importance of networks of scientists and government, the importance of sharing information and field trips. And we're working from this particular meeting, we're working to identify our priority areas and establish joint plans for the future. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Anusha. Well, I can clap for everyone. So just a reminder why Anwesha sets up her slides. She's going to present next. Just a reminder, there's a Q&A button down the bottom. So if you have questions that come up during the talks, feel free to put it in there and we can start answering them as soon as the talks are over. So Anwesha's just bringing her slides up.
Yeah, Chris, can you view them all right?
Yes, just click the slideshow button.
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's good. You're good to go.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining in. And today what I'm going to show you is a snippet of how a very common nutrient, nitrogen, is becoming a pollutant in the world's largest contiguous mangrove ecosystem. So, what I am showing you here is a map of the Sundarbans. It is shared jointly by India and Bangladesh, and you can see that it's located within the red box in India. This is a very fascinating ecosystem. It spreads over approximately 10,000 square kilometers of land. The yellow line you can see here is what separates India and Bangladesh. That's our international border. This is the world's second largest freshwater deltaic system. So you have three major rivers known as the Ganga, Brahmaputra, and Meghna that flows and forms this delta. Consequently, you have a very high freshwater flow in this region. You have very high local precipitation and seasonal precipitation. Consequently, what happens is that this ecosystem has a very high suspended particulate matter. So whenever you go into the water, you can see that the water is completely brown in color. So why it's so interesting is that when you're out in this ecosystem, and I hope this will
That video is working.
So that's the Royal Bengal tiger. It is the largest predator that exists in any swampland. And consequently, to conserve the tiger, the ecosystem was brought to very high importance in India. So this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a Ramsar site, and obviously an ecosystem that India is greatly invested in conserving. What you'll also see is a lot of endemic species, such as the saltwater crocodile. We have breeding grounds for these, and very frequently in field you will see standoff between the crocodiles with other animals, which is what keeps the ecosystem going, really. And this is also what makes fieldwork in the Sundarbans extremely difficult and dangerous. So coming back to the geography, as I said that this is a very high priority environmental land for India. What you will see is that it is spread across quite a bit. We've had mangroves which were natural, which were removed, deforestation, then they had to be planted back because there was no way to conserve the shoreline. So we essentially have a gradient of on the west for planted mangroves to a very pristine ecosystem on the right, where absolutely no human activities are allowed. So what we have here is we have a regular monitoring, which can only be done by permission from the highest central authorities in the country. But we do have permits to go down every month, and we monitor these ecosystems for changes by looking at a lot of proxies. So we do environmental parameters, we look at metals, we look at how nutrient gradients are changing. And for the last decade or so, what we've seen is that nitrogen is steadily increasing in this ecosystem to values that are extremely unnatural and dangerous. So you will very frequently throughout the year, you'll find nitrate concentrations as high as 300 micromolar, and that is dangerous levels of nitrogen. And where this essentially comes from is because a lot of these mangrove forests are essentially being replaced by aquaculture to help livelihood, and the constant use of aquaculture or nitrogenous based compounds in the agricultural areas are being flushed down, and these are being stored in the ecosystem. And our biggest concern is that a lot of this nitrogen is extremely localized. So they form local pools of high nitrogen and they remain in that area, essentially leading to blooms, as you can see. So if you don't understand a lot of bacterial terms, all that you need to see in this stack bar plot is the variation in the community. And you will see that places which have high nitrogen essentially have very specific groups of bacteria, which is a major cause of concern because all of this can become pathogenic and lead to problems both for the natural biota and eventually in turn for the humans. So that's my presentation for today. I'll be very happy to discuss questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anwesha. That was really interesting, and I really enjoyed seeing the video and hearing that about how the monitoring is informing us. So I'll hand to Dr. Prasun now, and yep, hopefully we'll get some questions in soon.
Yeah, I will share my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, here we go. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I am Prasun Goswami from National Institute of Animal Health. Today, I'll be talking about the overall picture of threats of plastic pollution in mangrove ecosystems. So I just start with these. Every day we start our day with plastics. We are surrounded actually with plastic. This is one of the most wanted product human has produced ever since. So we cannot deny the fact that we can live without plastics. The problem lies here, whatever plastics we produce, over almost 90% get discarded in the environment, and only 9% comes back through the recycle process. So eventually this 90% end up in environment, and almost several fractions reach to the estuaries as well as mangrove ecosystems. So as a result, the human-made mass has already surpassed the living biomass on this earth, and plastic has emerged as the fifth largest climate polluter in this planet. And we can see the interaction of plastics in every spheres in this world. So coming to the mangroves are, as we can see from this global map, that mangroves mostly placed in the tropics and subtropic environments. And historically, these are the places where the human populations are also quite high. So naturally, the anthropogenic and the natural conflicts are more over here. So the plastic usage in these environments are also high. So this is the flow chart what's shown how plastic reach in the mangrove ecosystem. It comes from the domestic wastewater as well as agricultural waste, and also city-borne waste like wastewater treatment plants, which cannot trap most of the microplastics, ultimately reach through rivers to the uh, estuarine environment and as well as mangrove ecosystems. Also, mangroves receives lots of plastics from the oceans as well as aquaculture activities. So as a result, this is a recent study which was carried out in India. In this work, it was found in Indian Sundarbans, almost 56 tons of plastics was recorded immediately after 2020 Amphan cyclone. And it estimated nearly 4 metric ton of plastic that get discarded into the Sundarbans annually. And the study also projected that nearly 52 metric ton of plastics can be built up by 2060 by Indian Sundarbans in the Bay of Bengal environment. So, and also this is another review work recently. It was reported that mangroves specially work as a biological filter of these plastics. So the root system of mangroves can trap huge number of plastics than the surrounding environment. And what they found was concentrations of microplastics in mangrove root as well as sediment, water, and biota in around mangroves is significantly higher than the surrounding non-mangrove environments. So definitely mangroves is one of the biggest plastic pollution hotspot. So we cannot deny the fact, due to climate change, nowadays the number of plastics in the mangrove as well as coastal environment is increasing. This is one of the example from Hong Kong, where they found after Maggot typhoon in 2018, significant increase in the microplastic in the mangrove as well as coastal environment. And this was another study carried out in the Arabian coast in the Kerala, where they found after 2018 Kerala flood, significant increase in microplastics in water, bottom sediment, and beach sediments. And this was the photos were taken from the Indian Sundarbans where Anusha is working. So this was during 2020 Amphan flood. A lot of plastics got trapped within the mangroves, and our team did really great work to recover some of the plastics from these environments. So these are another aspects of plastics, that plastic can actually carry a lot of harmful chemicals with it. So not only the plastics alone, but the chemicals attached to the plastics also can harm to the mangroves. As well as plastics nowadays have been proved that it can carry antimicrobial resistance to the coastal environments. And also it can reshape the marine biodiversity or marine microbiota in these environments. So this is actually the plastic playing a major role in the One Health framework, as it has been suggested that plastic can act as both sink and source of emerging chemicals, and microplastic can play a significant role in propagation of antibiotic-resistant genes and pathogens in the environment, and also it raising concerns regarding their unknown effects on the One Health. So with this, I just finish my talk and I'll be happy to answer the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Prasun. That was a great overview. Gave us a great overview of the issue of plastics and some of the issues and impacts around plastics. So we'll go to the questions. Anusha and Anwesha, would you like to put your cameras back on? And Prasun sends his apologies if his camera's not working today. So I had one question that came online before the webinar actually, and it was about the resuspension of sediments and if that affects heavy metal pollution in the ecosystem. So Anusha, I wonder if you could comment on that question.
Yes, I think as we've seen with other sources of organic material that become resuspended with disturbances, I would expect the same to happen with heavy metals. In South Africa, when we've seen these large flood events come through, of course, that brings up a lot of runoff with it. So it brings a lot of pollutants with it, and it would resuspend a lot of sediment within the estuarine environments. So I would expect that to be a major source going into the marine environment. And we've seen that with the plastics, and we've seen that with other chemical events that have happened in South Africa. Thanks.
And is there any way to trace that? So if, you know, if we have an event that causes resuspension of sediments and I guess dissolving of heavy metals back into the water column, or is taking the plastics out of the mangroves, so we trace where it's coming from, or so we know where the problem starts?
I'm not 100% sure, and maybe one of the other panelists might have a view on it. But I think it would depend on how much is happening in the catchment areas and in the areas that connect the river to the ocean to be able to pick that up. I think with nutrients like Anusha was talking about, that might be possible.
Yeah, and Anwesha, did you want to comment?
Yeah, so what's been happening in the Indian Sundarbans is that since it's connected to a very long river, you have a lot of the heavy metals coming in because of the river flow. And, owing to the sediment nature and redox potential of the delta, these heavy metals remain strongly adhered to the sediment particles, and essentially the concentration keeps on increasing over a prolonged period of time.
So
And
redox, can you just explain redox for us, those of us that are chemists?
So, so redox
And
is
feel free to
very
turn your camera back
fairly-
on, Anwesha.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Thanks.
So, redox is relatively simple to understand. So we know that metals exist in various ionic forms, right? But not all ionic forms are disastrous. Okay, so if it's inert, it doesn't essentially cause any problems. If it's in a form where it can react with other things, that's when the issue starts happening, right? So mangrove sediments, essentially because of the low oxygen, continue to remain poor in oxygen levels throughout the year, and you have low pH conditions, and this essentially helps the heavy metal to remain in a state where they can react with other forms, right? So this essentially starts to act as stressors after a certain point of time. So in Sundarbans, what we've seen is that these are signatures that can be picked up directly, so you can run a metal analysis to see how much concentration is there. You can do a metal speciation, which tells you what form or what ionic form the metal is in. Or you can go back to the biological community and look at if it's telling you. So we've been seeing an increasing trends of genes that are essentially heavy metal resistant. So the organisms are already getting evolved. And one has to remember, so think about it for a biological cell. It's so small, like for a bacterium, right? It does not require to harvest energy in anything that it doesn't need for survival. So if a bacterial cell steadily maintains a big gene like a heavy metal pollution resistant gene, then one has to know that there is a constant stress which the bacterium is trying to overcome.
So that's one way of monitoring for heavy metal
Yeah.
pollution, is to check the genes of the bacteria, see what
Absolutely.
they're
And
dealing with.
yeah. And so what is also happening globally is that the freshwater flow continues to keep lowering in major estuaries around the world, right? And when you have a high saline environment, you obviously have a higher dissolution of these heavy metals as well. And the concern happens is that these metals are slowly seeping into freshwater aquifers and then going or entering into the human ecosystem, right? Because if there's a deep aquifer where the heavy metals are now in reactive form and that's being used by human populations in the surrounding area, and that's how it enters into our system.
Okay, so just to check you understand, so the metals sort of build up in the sediment because of the chemistry of the sediment, and then as freshwater flow goes down, you can get a link back to freshwater aquifers as the groundwater, basically. So you can have the heavy metals going back up to where we might be drawing it up to drink or to use in agriculture.
Absolutely. So that's where arsenic is increasing every day in our coastal ecosystems.
Sounds like a very difficult issue to manage. Well, there's another question on heavy metals, so we'll just continue on that theme for now, and I'll come back to the question about nitrogen in a minute. Maybe Anwesha could answer this in the chat. Someone's asked about studies available on heavy metals in the water of the India part of Sundarban. So if you could share some studies in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I will. So there's actually quite a few studies. So IIT Kharagpur does a regular monitoring of heavy metals in the groundwater, and what they study is the interconnections between the groundwater aquifers. So you can look at papers by Abhijit Mukherjee. You can also look at some of my papers where you should be able to find the values.
Thank you. And then it sounds like a very intractable issue for policy. Like what sorts of approaches can we take to managing this kind of issue? Sounds like one of them is maintaining fresh water flows, but are there others?
So, Chris, to be very honest, this is more difficult than we can say. So, a lot of these heavy metals actually come from the port areas and the industrial belts in the upstream regions of the river courses, right? And there is absolutely no way but from regular monitoring to see what the patchy distribution of these heavy metals are, right? And in terms of policy, so India has very strict policies in terms of throwing away wastewater, right? But in a developing economy, you can understand how much of the policy can actually be followed. And what is rather unfortunate is that you have very high human populations in these regions. So the Sundarban alone has 4.5 million people living in 100 islands. And so you can imagine, so these are 100 islands which hardly have any fresh water, but you still have people living there, right? And there's a new policy wherein the government actually makes manure out of the landfill wastage, right? And there is no way to extract the metals out of that landfill waste when it becomes manure. And then you're using this manure as a supposedly organic material into your agricultural fields, but the heavy metal remains, right? And this is where the sediment comes in, that the sediment again has a pH which allows the metals to remain adhered to sediment particles, essentially building up concentrations over time. So there's not much that policy can really do. And there are very subtle things that we don't realize, that something as simple as a nail polish also has heavy metals, right?
Yeah.
So what do you do? There's only so much that policy can do in this topic.
Well, I'll hand over to Anusha as well. She has a hand up, maybe to comment on that point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just wanted to say from our side, and thanks for those for that input from the Cinderbunds. Within our estuaries, I think it's important to understand the the complexities between, especially in South Africa, the impacts of our wastewater treatments and the runoff from those wastewater treatments into the estuary and out to sea, and then also the interplay between our industrial sites. So we had very recently, and this is what I wanted to say, we had an example where a chemical factory was accused of emptying out a waste dam a few days before a fish kill happened within an estuary. And of course, the question becomes, was it the chemicals within the waste dam that caused it? And the company said, no, it was actually a sewage spill that came from one of the wastewater treatments that dropped the oxygen and therefore led to the fish kill. So it's very difficult to separate the two aspects. But implementation of the existing policies and like India, South Africa does have very good legislation, but we lack in terms of our capacity to implement those legislations. And of course, with chemical companies, the polluter must pay when these type of events do occur. But trying to get that process going is quite a challenging one. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Might go back to Anwesha. We had a question about impacts of nitrogen on mangroves and their inhabitants. And Anusha maybe has some experience working in this area. And then after this question, there's a couple of questions about plastics. And I know there was a lot of interest in plastics, so we'll go to plastics after we talk about nitrogen. Thanks, Anwesha.
Okay, so this is a rather difficult question to answer because one has to constantly remember that nitrogen is not a pollutant. Nitrogen is an essential material for survival, be it any kind of biotic survival. It only becomes a concern when it starts to accumulate. And what happens is that you have species in the environment that can survive in very high nitrogen concentrations, but it starts to become toxic for everything else. So given a highly diverse ecosystem, if you look at the microbes, you'll have a bunch only that can survive in the high nitrogen conditions. So what happens is that the moment the nitrogen spikes, you are becoming selective. You are putting pressure such that everything else dies and only one or two can survive, right? Leading to bloom-like conditions. So a cascade of natural events then follows. So there is no one effect of high nitrogen. There is a series of effects. So you have a lot of reaction chemistry which goes haywire. So if you have a high nitrate, you keep on depleting ammonium. So essentially nothing grows because ammonium would be the choice of nitrogen for many organisms. So that becomes selective. It starts to cut out oxygen, right? Because the initial high nitrogen has spiked productivity. So it has essentially helped organisms to grow. But then everything else started to die. So
And that comes back to the potential cause of the fish kill that Anusha
Absolutely.
mentioned, was that the nitrogen in the wastewater causes spike in bacteria that depleted oxygen. So
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. Yeah. So not one single thing, but a cascade of events.
Thank you. Anusha, do you want to comment on nitrogen? Otherwise, we'll go to plastics.
I just wanted to maybe ask and to comment. So recently on this field trip that we went on, we went to an estuary called Isipingo. When we were there was quite a smell associated with the water column, and the water itself was a very dark color. And it was one of the few sites where we've seen sort of a mass of water hyacinth growing within the water column. And I think which links back to the invasive species and invasive species within the mangrove forest. So I wanted to just share that and then just ask is that something that's happening in the
just to clarify, the nitrogen is maybe contributing to invasive species, invasive plant species growth. Yeah.
So the water hyacinth sort of takes over when the fresh waters where the salinity is quite low, but there's high levels of nitrogen.
And Weston.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. Actually, it's very interesting that water hyacinth was actually introduced in many places around the world to combat heavy metal pollution, right? And it backfired because we never think of our policies before just putting something in the environment. So places which had heavy metals, water hyacinth was essentially known to entrap a lot of these heavy metals, right? But what happened was that it could also very quickly use up the nitrogen in the ecosystem, cover up the surface, cut off oxygen flow, and essentially kill everything else that's around. Where in the water hyacinth is the only thing that keeps on surviving thereafter, right? So yeah, so a lot of complex and as Anusha was mentioning, so the smell that you're getting is essentially sulfide, which is again a byproduct because of the decrease in oxygen. So
Mhm.
I mean, we keep studying all of this, but it's so intertwined. It's just very difficult to answer these things.
So you're like a detective, you go out there and you're taking measurements and you're smelling and being like, oh, this is a system with low oxygen. Really clever. Let's talk about plastics a bit as well. So quite a few questions about that. So the first one was if you can comment, and maybe you can go to Prasun for this one, and we haven't heard much from him yet. Do you have any insights on how microplastics accumulate, like what types of plastics and so forth? And if we
Yeah,
can track that through sediments.
I was just reading the questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah. What I think is last year we carried out a research in Indian Sundarbans where we collected vertical profiles, that is sediment cores, and Sundarbans. Of course, I did not share the results here because of lack of time. What we found was sediment cores give a clear mirror of time-lapse photography. So how plastics accumulate in the environment. And we found plastics tends to get accumulate after 2002 in these Indian mangrove ecosystems. And as far as type is concerned, we mostly found like fiber and fragments in these environments, and like polyethylene, polypropylene, and polystyrenes. These are the three types of plastic mostly recorded in this environment. So this is actually going with the global plastic pollution scenario or global plastic production scenarios. Like these are the three mostly consumed plastic polymers in the world. So we found a similar signature in the Indian Sundarbans. Of course, like sediment core gives a lot of story about plastics in these environments. Yeah.
Did you say they started in 2002? That was when it really
It's
started.
not like that. It's like
Yeah.
probably the consumption has increased a lot during that time.
Mhm.
And also, one thing need to consider, mangrove ecosystem is like a high energy zone in terms of bioturbations. So a lot of animals, they also ingest microplastics like annelids, and they can go deeper down. So yeah, it is always better to cross check with like dating of the core. So we are in the process of doing that work. So that's why, yeah. So I cannot say exactly at that time, but the
Yeah.
signature suggests that during 2002.
Okay, so
From
saying it happened that we saw an acceleration of
yeah,
plastic use or
accelerations.
disposal or something. It's very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
And Anusha, do you want to share something on the plastics?
I actually wanted to ask Prasan, have you been able to correlate maybe the carbon storage in your cores with your microplastics, and if is that something that you're interested in doing?
We did not think about it earlier. Yeah, we can do that as per carbon storage, but we are beg your pardon. We are in the process of carrying out dating of the sediment core to exactly calculate the age of the sediment core to check when the plastic started accumulating in that environment. Yeah.
And is there, I was to ask any panelists, is there concern around plastics having impact on carbon sequestration or storage?
I think
Just an
plastic.
unknown.
Just I want to add one point with the carbon sequestration. It's like plastic is like storing the carbon for a longer time in the environment, and it takes thousands of years to break down. So eventually, if we increase the plastic production, So we go towards the storage of carbon in terms of in plastics, but not in the biological form. So that is going to affect the global carbon sink, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like if you took a sediment core and the mangroves, there's carbon in the sediment, and some of that can be organic and some of that could actually be plastics.
Yeah. So we are losing the organic part.
Mm. And did you want
Yeah, I
to?
would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you want to speak to? You mentioned in your talk very briefly, it was a very interesting point that different types of chemicals or drugs that we use can attach to plastics, and then the plastic becomes like a mechanism to deliver them into the environment.
The moment plastic reaches to the environment, first it forms an ecocorona around the plastics, like it attract microbes as well as a lot of chemicals. Like the surface of the plastic start absorbing pollutants like PCBs, trace metals, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, also antibiotics. So if we take concentrations of these chemicals in water and plastics, recently we found almost like 10,000 folds higher concentration of polyaromatic hydrocarbons in the plastics from Tokyo area. It's not in the mangrove environment, of course, in freshwater environment. So this plastic is not only act as a physical polluter for the organism, but also it act as a pollutant soup or pollutant capsule for marine organisms. And also the layer of chemicals on the plastics select certain types of bacteria, and if antibiotic is present on the plastics, so it acts as bottleneck for other bacteria to grow. So only antibiotic resistant bacteria can flourish on the plastic. So that way, plastic also serve as a vector or like vehicle for the antibiotic resistant bacteria to be transferred into the different environments. Since plastic can travel a long distance, so this is one of the best carrier medium for them to go from one place to another. Yeah.
That's really concerning. So, and I guess it's raising the point that we shouldn't consider these different pollutants on their own. There's actually interactions between them.
Yes. Actually, what I personally believe, like nowadays, a lot of coastal cleanup campaigns are going on. It is great. Uh, Also, we need to consider not only the plastic, but we need to ban the plastic additives also. So
Sorry, ban the plastic what?
Plastic additives. A lot of harmful chemicals have been added to the plastics.
Oh,
So
okay.
we need to bring awareness about the plastic additives, and this is the role of informed scientific policies, and that's why we need rigorous monitoring of the plastic additives and as well as antibiotic resistance on the plastics. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. And I'll come back to you later then on a question I had about what should we be monitoring. But I just want to get to this question first from someone about campaign strategies to raise awareness in communities. And so they asked if people have experience or thoughts to share on campaign strategies to raise awareness around plastic pollution, but feel free to answer on any type of pollution. How do we better raise awareness in communities so people can be informed and act? Something's happening with my screen. Anwesha, did you have your hand up there or Prasun?
Yeah. So, the Sundarbans has a lot of people who are not indigenous but have been living in that area for a very, very long time. To be very honest, we actually have never required to teach them. They already know what's good for the ecosystem, and mostly in all cases, their policies are not harming the ecosystem. So they are in a sustainable living pattern with the ecosystem. They only take as much as they need. And because they're mindful that if they use everything up, they're the ones who are going to be losing a lot more than everybody else, right? So it's the conflict comes in with the policy people is because we try and go and give them a superficial solution, which would either require more time investment or monetary investment in their part, and it never works out. But then we've had successes in a lot of cases where we've asked the community that you tell us what is good. And all of those have always worked because they know what's best for the ecosystem, they know what's best for them. So they are in a perfect harmony. It's always when the outsiders go and, try and prove that, oh, we're scientists, we know better. That's when the problem happens.
Thanks for sharing that, Anwesha. I just, on that note, I just want to make a little plug. Our actual next webinar that I'll be inviting people to in a couple of days is on local ecological knowledge and its use in mangrove conservation. So that's a great segue to bring up that next webinar. Anusha, did you have something to share as well on campaigns and awareness?
I think in the South African context, we rely a lot on our civil organizations and non-governmental organizations to drive both the education side as well as the practical aspects of clearing different areas of pollutants. And I know for my research group, we really need to find a better way to communicate what we're collecting in the field and producing it in a way that's consumable by greater society. And we haven't done that very well so far. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. So yeah, I guess in terms of how we report on pollution, there was a question that came online earlier about what should we be monitoring. I'll just look at the question wording exactly, but yeah, what should we be monitoring and for short and long-term impact criteria specifically? So yeah, do you have comments on the monitoring of pollution? And they specifically asked too about an organisation working on pollution control and removal. What they should be most interested in monitoring to see the impact of their work.
I would say it can be very context specific in some cases. I think globally, eutrophication is a major threat to most of our coastal ecosystems. So from a wastewater treatment perspective, if that is one of the problems that they're dealing with, I guess those organic pollutants would be very important to measure. And then, of course, if they're in a more industrialized situation, then your heavy metals and the more toxic ones would be better to measure. But I think it's context specific.
And the things you'd expect I don't know much about pollution control and removal, but if you're doing those sorts of activities, what changes would you expect to see?
I think in a high nutrient environment, if you're able to control your nutrients, that should increase the chemical quality of your water, and maybe oxygen would be a good one to measure in that case. When I look at as a biological scientist, when I'm looking at a forest, a mangrove forest, I'm always asking myself, are the different life stages present in order to keep that forest going, or do we have a forest that's stagnating into old age because the resilience of your life stages are not present? So there's your chemical monitoring and your physical monitoring, and then the biological monitoring, I would say, probably needs to look at the microbial side, and then needs to look at whether or not your species are able to maintain themselves in viable populations. But that's quite a broad answer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's good to have a broad answer. And I think on the biological side, you're sort of talking about, say, a tree, you want to see seedlings coming through underneath the canopy to know that this is a healthy forest. And when the canopy tree dies, the seedlings will come up. Yeah, so you get that full spectrum of the pollution as well as its impacts on the biology. I was going to ask Prasun about plastics. I mean, some countries and jurisdictions are bringing bans on certain types of plastics, like plastic bags or particular forms of plastics. So if you're a government monitoring your mangroves, or first of all, I guess would mangroves be a good place monitor to see if your policy is working, and if they are, what would you be monitoring? What types of changes?
Yeah, Chris, it's a very interesting questions because in 2012, 2020, I believe Indian government banned single-use plastics usage in India. So a lot of positive impact came after that. And nowadays we can see many products which has been replaced by which was previously replaced by plastics, again came back to the market. But still we need to bring a lot of awareness. Like I personally believe PET bottle is one of the biggest issue in the world, like single-use PET bottles. And especially countries like in Japan, we use a lot of PET bottles here. We have maybe thousands of vending machines around Tokyo or around the Japan, and even from 50 ml to 5 liter, all sizes of PET bottles are available. So I personally really do not understand why we need such a small PET bottles in the environment. And it's of course Japan has a good solid waste management practices, but the same practices, if it is implemented in other parts of the world, it is great. Like collecting all the garbage and then burn it or process it properly. But if we see in the global south, the solid waste management practices is still in the primitive form, or it is not sufficient, and that's the problem starts. So I believe government should sanction more funds towards the building up the solid waste management and as well as garbage collection. So this is more important part instead of collecting plastic from the shore.
Yeah, it's like a whole of system approach. It's not just about doing something in mangroves, it's across the board.
Yeah. So practically, once microplastic reach to the marine environment, it is impossible to collect. So it is always better to stop from the source. But we also cannot stop plastic from our daily use. So it's better to increase the recycling facilities as well as solid waste management facilities. Yeah.
And just quickly before I go to Anwesha, you did mention alternatives to plastic, and I've noticed like in the shops here now, there's like various plastic containers made of sugar cane or silicone and that sort of thing. Are they any better than plastics?
Yeah, it's a bit controversial question because plastic, the two sellable point of plastic is durability and the low cost. Still, the bio-based plastic has to come up with this. Most of the bio-based plastics are not that durable like the synthetic plastics, and also the production cost is way cheaper for the synthetic plastics. So research has to develop in this way also.
Are they better? Are they bioplastics? So if I buy a PET bottle made of sugarcane, is it better for the environment if it gets lost in the ocean, or just as
again,
bad?
Again, we need to do monitoring for that because recently some research are coming out like bio-based plastics like PLA and all, they do show some toxicities to the marine environment. So it is not always it is safe, but of course it's a better alternative.
It's a big unknown. And Wisha had a comment there, and another question's come up in the chat.
Yeah, so just a quick comment on the pollutants. So with the mangrove ecosystems, the reason why we are struggling is that a lot of this pollution is not generated within the mangrove ecosystem, but is in fact coming with the rivers, which is why it's becoming more and more challenging because it keeps on building up within the mangroves, because that's like the last sieve before it goes into the open ocean. So that's something that we've been struggling with in India for sure, that the rivers transport a lot of whatever kind of pollutants that you're looking at, and essentially it gets dumped into the mangrove ecosystems.
Thank you. I can continue on with that one because the question that came in is pretty much on that point, which is what measures can be taken in cities which have mangroves to conserve them from plastics and heavy metals. So do you have, or any of the other panelists have experience on working outside the mangrove landscape, I guess, on policy or science to inform how we stop the pollution going into the rivers? Well, it's not an area you've worked on.
So in India we have like a lot of STPs, along the major cities, and they are always located close to the rivers, and you essentially have the sewage water being passed through the septic tank, and so that a lot of these heavy metals can be leached back before the effluent water is actually discharged into the rivers. But a lot of these always come with policy issues and implementation issues. So I think that's where the biggest challenge is for maintaining low levels of pollution in the mangroves. We do have regular cleanups, which are in many cases initiated by NGOs working in the local regions. So they can go down and physically remove the microplastics, but very honestly, there's not much that we can do in case of microplastics. So you cannot keep on sieving seawater to get rid of microplastics. That's not possible. But again, there has been a lot of policy discussions, I think, in most part of the world, where we've thought of interventions where you could probably have a certain type of fish which can grow faster, essentially eat up the pollutants, things like that. So again, a lot of mitigation processes that would need a lot of research being before they're actually implemented on the ground.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And we'll go to, unless there's any final comments, we'll go to Anusha for the final comment, and then we're at time. So
Sure. Yeah, just from my side, from a South African point of view, we need a major investment in infrastructure that deals with our wastewater systems. And I think it came up to a price that we needed to upgrade our infrastructure. So that really would be a first step, but that takes a lot of investment. A lot of civil organizations and non-governmental organizations have installed litter traps on our rivers and side arms of the rivers that has an impact on clearing some of the bigger plastics going into the systems. So there are small projects that take a lot of investment, financial as well as human, in order to make them successful. But yeah, it comes down to human behavior, and how do we change human behavior, not just in the mangroves, but at the sources of these pollutants, and how do we get people to care more about what they're doing with their waste, and how they're treating their part of the world. So that's my last comment. Thank you very much.
thank you, Anusha. And Anwesha, Prasun, did you have any more final comments before we close the webinar?
I just want to mention that regarding the control of pollutants in the environment, it is very important to teach citizens their responsibilities. This is most of the countries is lacking currently, like discarding of waste properly in dustbins. This is very basic things, and most of the people, we really do not understand that. And also the social cost of pollution, which is need to bring to the school syllabus. This is what I believe. This I have seen in Japan, how they teach to the very small kids from their beginning how to respect environment. So it's better always, before going for traditional classes, we first take out our kids to the nature and show what is the natural beauties and what would be the effect of pollution on it. So I think this is one of the most important part as a scientist, as a citizen, to bring to the society, to bring the scientific knowledge and share to the common citizen. This is one of the most important part to control plastic pollution.
Thank you, Professor. That's a really nice and positive note to end on. And in all of this work, we're always thinking about what earth are we handing on to the next generation. And I think the education communication is a great way to do that. And all of your comments too tie into the question we had earlier about campaigning and awareness raising in communities and the importance of that. So I'd just like to thank everybody for listening today, and I thank our three panelists. I certainly learned a lot, learned about redox in sediments, and I learned about antibiotic resistance in plastics and a whole range of topics. So really informative webinar. Thank you very much for your time and presenting today and sharing your thoughts. So I hope to see you all next webinar.